Thank you everybody for joining us. This is the NLCC webinar called Curriculum Development Process, and we are getting started with this right now. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping items before we continue. I'd like everybody to sign in, and which that means is, even though I can kind of see your names on the participant list, if you would sign in your name at the bottom in the chat box, because more than one person probably is signed in with you or viewing it with you, we'd like to make sure we have everybody's name on there. Also, we are recording this webinar and we'll send an email to all the registrants with links to the event page. So you'll have a copy of this recording to view later. And we have also muted your microphone. And if you have any questions while we're doing this presentation, please put them in the chat box. Next slide, please, Tachini. So before we begin, we'd like to go ahead and do a couple of land acknowledgements. Excuse me. The NLCC Training and Technical Assistance Center is located in Spokane, Washington, and we acknowledge that we are on the unceded land of the Spokane people, and that these lands were once the major trading center for the Spokane people as they shared this place and welcomed other area tribes through the relations, history, trade, and ceremony. We also want to acknowledge that the land holds the spirit of the place through its knowledge, culture, and all the original people since time immemorial. And this was posted by the city of Spokane, and we chose to go ahead and use it because they actually said this pretty nicely. And being a member of the Spokane tribe, I was very happy to see that. Also, the Administration for Native Americans is located in Washington, D.C., and the District of Columbia shares borders with Maryland and Virginia and connects with lands along the Anacostia and Potomac rivers. These river systems and current national parks are where the Piscataway, Pamunkey, and the Nantego or Nanachoke, Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Monacan, and the Powhatan cultures thrived, and I apologize if I mispronounced all those names. According to the National Park Service, the region was rich in natural resources and supported the local native people. 40 years after the arrival of the Europeans, only a quarter of the original occupants remained. And I got this from the Association of Research Libraries, who actually put together a really nice, succinct land acknowledgement. Next slide, please, Tachini. So let me introduce our presenter. If you haven't attended one of these before, Tachini Pete. He is the Salish Navajo and is the current Training and Technical Assistance Director for the Native Language Community Coordination, or NLCC, Training and Technical Assistance Center. Tachini works on language transfer capacity, second language acquisition, and researching and documenting the Salish language. Tachini's experience teaching at all levels, preschool through college, as well as an executive leader, understanding funding agencies, and advocate for language revitalization, will support the needs of the NLCC cohort in the coming year. Tachini also holds a Master of Business Administration from Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and he owns a small business called Tachini Jumps. So Tachini, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you, Maria. So I'm glad to be presenting this information. I just want to start with a short little prayer for our time today. Quadlan Sutin kan Hwaks Lukashushuel. Mika Wichentum Lukax Hui. Kakoetl Lukas Busiat Hwa Schadhad. Mi Hast Lukas Hui. Kahuitst Tex Pacht. Mi Takax and Kleptamentum. Kahuitst Tex Yot. Mit milk ukex en sut lutel esia ut ea kobiatche. So the goal of this webinar is to provide an overview of the curriculum development process as it relates to Indigenous languages. The learning objectives as a result of the webinar are that you all will be able to determine a learning path strategy based on the language community's current capacities, as well as be able to create an outline curriculum framework. So the first part of this is to just give a brief overview of what I call these interdependent capacities. And these are the language teachers, language knowledge, and learning path. Each one of these is a capacity that the any language community has, any language program has, um, and they all are interdependent capacities. So in order to um, facilitate the acquisition of a language, you need language teachers, and teachers is kind of a loosely defined term, and that is anybody that has the ability to facilitate language learning is what I would consider a language teacher. And the capacity of language teacher is dependent on the number of teachers you have in a community. It's dependent on the skill levels, the abilities to teach and transfer language. It's also dependent on the education levels and the training that individuals have in helping others learn and acquire language to be able to transfer that language to someone else. Um, Language knowledge is all about the understanding of one's language or one's community language, and that capacity is determined by the ability of teachers or curriculum development people to draw on that language knowledge in order to create an effective learning path. And the learning path capacity is um, a language program's um, creation of a learning path. How well is it defined? How well is it documented? And that's kind of what this presentation is all about, is to develop that learning path, which is also called the curriculum. So these three capacities here are essential for having an effective language program. You need teachers to teach the language. You need to know the language in order to know what to teach. And you need some kind of guiding, some kind of guide in order to know where you're going with your teaching. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the language community is what comprises all of those three capacities. And the first one is the curriculum or the learning path development is what I'll be talking about today. And that is dependent on the level of knowledge that's contained within the language community, as well as the skill and ability levels of teachers. So with language knowledge, you can only teach what you know. And if you don't know something about your language, that could be words, the vocabulary, it could be the grammar features of your language. If you don't know those things, it's impossible really to teach about those things unless you're in some kind of unless your teaching is just immersing people within a language community. Those things don't need to be taught. And then teaching capacity is also drawn from your language community. That's the people in your community that can speak the language or have some level of proficiency in the language. That's the number of teachers that are available to teach the language to others that don't know. It's also the skill and ability and education level of those teachers. That was what makes up teaching capacity. So for the purposes of this presentation, curriculum refers to the overarching guide or structure that creates the learning path that leads to some specified learning goal. So other parts of curriculum include things such as individual units within a curriculum. It can be the lesson guides. It can also include lesson plans. Those are all substructures of an overarching curriculum. Also in curriculum, people often associate curriculum with the student learning materials or the support materials that teachers use. That is true. It is part of the curriculum. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm speaking about the overarching guide, basically the roadmap of how you get to one point to another point, and what are all the the stops along the way that will get you to that end goal. So I just want to set that up so to frame what I mean by curriculum in this presentation. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what the curriculum development process looks like. So the curriculum development process is a cycle, and it continuously goes around and around. And depending on where you are at in your curriculum development process in your community, maybe you have a curriculum already, and you just need to take a look at it and refine it. Perhaps you are already in the development process. But from the perspective of developing a curriculum from scratch, first you would start with the analyzing the needs, and then from there you determine what design this curriculum is going to look like, and then you develop the curriculum. And then the next part is implementation, which is essentially you're teaching individuals from this guide, from this curriculum, from this learning path. And then as you teach, perhaps somewhere in between or maybe at the end, you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of that curriculum. How well did it go? Were there areas that were lacking, or whatever it may be that you determine? And then from that evaluation, you refine the curriculum, and then you reanalyze. Are we still do we still have the same needs, or do we need to change the direction? And then again, you design, you develop, and then you implement. So it's a cycle that continuously goes around and around and around. A curriculum should not be a static document or a process. It's a continually evolving and refining process, and especially with language, because the efforts that we are doing in our languages often are very new for our language, and we're all in different stages of curriculum development. And when you feel like you have an end product, you shouldn't feel that way. You should feel like, I want to make it better. I want to refine it. I want to make the learning time shorter. I want to improve the sequence or whatever it may be. So this is the curriculum development process as a cycle. So the first part about the curriculum development process is to analyze all the things that it's about asking questions of yourself, of your community. So the first and most important thing in analyzing your language efforts is what needs will I need to address for my community, and all of this analyzation is about asking questions about yourself, your community. What are the current teaching capacities? How many teachers do I have that can be employed in implementing this curriculum? What are their skill and ability levels? That's going to determine, how far you can go with your curriculum, how advanced it can be, how much detail you're going to need in this curriculum. Are the curriculum development people going to have to go as fine as creating lesson plans and scripts for those lesson plans? That's going to be a determination of your teacher's skill and ability levels. What segment of the community has interest in learning the language? Is it the youth? Is it in the schools? Do we have an immersion school? Is this for adults? Is this an after school program? Is this, there's all kinds of things that it could be for. And it's important to define what those, all of these aspects are in order to address and then determine, what direction you're going to take your language in. Um, and then, what is the community's capacity to participate? How much time does the segment that you've identified, how much time do they have to commit to the program? Is this a curriculum that's going to be used in a public school? In a public school, there's not very much time to devote to learning, so that really limits your ability to, or limits the time that you can devote to learning and your curriculum development. Are there funds available to compensate learners? This would be, for instance, adults in a community. If they're being compensated, you have a lot more time to devote to those individuals. And then there's the community readiness assessment. I'll have Maria talk a little bit about that.
And thank you, Tachini. So the community readiness assessment is actually part of what's called the community readiness model, or CRM. And the CRM is a tool for communities to determine whether they are ready to change some issue within their communities, such as language. And so for language, we found that the CRM helps to identify whether the community is prepared to begin, improve, or sustain a language program. And it also provides information on where the community is at for supporting a language program. So if the community is willing and able to achieve the goal of the community-based language efforts, they work on the community readiness model and do a needs assessment to find out where on this continuum they are at. And that helps the language program develop strategies or a strategic plan on how to go ahead and implement their language program. Okay.
Thank you, Maria.
You're welcome, Tachini.
So again, analyzing what you want to do within your language efforts is really vital to helping shape what a curriculum will look like. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the needs that can be addressed. So when you're looking at the needs of your community and the things that you want to do, it's really important to be specific in developing a curriculum. So some examples here that I've listed, some needs that might be addressed is, number one is, does my community need to build teaching capacity? That could be a big need for your community. And the reason why I listed that one first is because in my experience and seeing many language programs around the country, is that teaching capacity is probably the biggest limiting factor for language revitalization across the board. And it's something that is vital for a community in order to transfer language to others, is you need to have a really strong teaching capacity. Without teachers, it's really difficult to transfer language in an efficient manner. People can learn language individually on their own, but it takes a very long time, and time is something that many language programs don't have the luxury of having. Another need that may be identified is maybe you want to increase the language proficiency of some group of people in your community to, say, an intermediate level. And so this could be a need that you identify. For instance, maybe you have a group of people that have a basic level of language proficiency, and you want to target that group and bring them up to an intermediate level. Then so if that is your need, your curriculum is going to be designed around that need of bringing a novice proficient speaker up to an intermediate proficiency level. So identifying the need is very important in order to to develop and create the curriculum around that need. Some other needs that may um, come up is maybe you want to master language around a particular domain, such as, in a kitchen, or maybe it's classroom language or school language, and whatever other kind of domain that you may come up with. Maybe it's communication in a certain setting, or I want to interact with my kids at home. You need to identify what it is that you want to accomplish. What needs are you going to address in developing this curriculum? So you've identified your need. The next thing that's important is to be able to create some kind of guide in developing your curriculum so that you stay on task, and the curriculum development process, whoever may be involved, whatever team or community members that you have involved in this, they all have an understanding of what the mission is of this curriculum. So developing a mission statement is important in order to keep individuals within a team or an individual on task in developing this curriculum, so you don't stray off and go in many directions, so that you stay in one direction and in your development. So what is the mission of the curriculum? That's a important question to be answered for your curriculum development. What language transfer strategies are you going to use to implement this curriculum? Are you going to use an immersion methodology? Are you going to use translation? Hopefully you're not going to use word lists as your primary curriculum development process, but that may be the only way that you can do it. So determining all these things are kind of your guiding principles to keep you on task in developing your curriculum. So an example mission statement here that I've provided is in this example curriculum would be to facilitate the acquisition of language through immersion to an intermediate level of proficiency in a safe and supportive environment. So for me, that would be my mission in developing this particular curriculum as an example. So the next thing in your analyzation is you've determined your needs, you've created a mission statement for your curriculum. Now you need to set some goals and objectives. And again, this analyzation is all about asking questions of yourself, of your community, of your curriculum. What am I going to do? What am I going to achieve? What's the goal of this curriculum? So it's important to set goals so that you can evaluate your effectiveness in implementation of the curriculum. Again, that's that cycle. Evaluation is a very critical part of developing curriculum and refining it over time. So some example goals here and objectives in this curriculum that I'm developing as an example. So learners will achieve an intermediate proficiency level at the end of 12 months. So I'm setting up a time in 12 months is what my goal is. And objective is learners will complete 6 units. So I'm setting up how many units I have in this curriculum from novice low to intermediate high. So I'm setting up the range that I'm trying to accomplish here as an objective. Novice low is where my students are going to be at, and I want them to get to an intermediate high. And these 6 units are going to be in 2-month intervals. So I've set up a time frame. I've set up the scope of what I want to achieve here. So that's an example of a goal and objective. So another example here is learners will be able to communicate basic needs in a school environment. So in another curriculum, say in a school, this could be a goal for your curriculum. So a couple of objectives in achieving this goal would be learners will learn a language to ask basic questions and respond to commands in the first month. So I'm setting up a time frame again here in month 1. This is what the learners are going to be able to do. And the second objective there is learners will develop vocabulary related to common classroom items in the second month. So again, these are objectives in accomplishing and achieving the goal. So and another part here is at the end of this curriculum, what is the outcome? What's the outcome of this curriculum? And being able to state these outcomes is very important because it also helps in measuring and evaluating your curriculum. So outcomes are the benefits of a project. You know, what is the benefit of this curriculum? What is it going to do? And then outputs are the products and services of a project. So for instance, an outcome for a curriculum could be the curriculum document itself. That could be an output. So some a question to ask is what are the outcomes of this curriculum that I'm developing? This is all part of analyzation of your language community and the capacities that you have and how you want to develop this curriculum. So some example outcomes. One is to increase teaching capacity by producing more speakers. That is the benefit of this curriculum. That's an outcome. Another outcome could be to grow the speaking community. That's what I want this curriculum to do, is to grow the speaking community. Another outcome could be to inspire and motivate language learning among community members. Again, these outcomes should be stated within the development of your or part of the analyzation of your language community in preparation for the development of your curriculum. All of these things are the guiding principles in the development of your curriculum. If you know what your outcomes are going to be, then you can design your curriculum, your learning path, so that you achieve those outcomes. And the outcomes also keep you on target for where you're going. So we've analyzed our language community, and we now are ready to take all the information that we've gathered. We've set up our guiding principles. We have our goals. We have our mission statement to keep us on track of where we're going. We've set up some goals and some objectives, so we know where we're going to go. The next process here is to design the curriculum. So the design of the curriculum, which is often referred to as the scope, and the scope is, what does the entire thing look like? What does the entire learning path look like? What's the curriculum going to look like? You know, what time frame do we have to work with here? Do we have a quarter? Is this curriculum designed for 1 quarter? Is this curriculum designed for a school year, 2 years, etc.? You have to know what your time frame is in order to help design the curriculum. How often and how long will the learners meet, or what time can they spend in learning this language? What formats are you going to use to implement this curriculum? Are these going to be in-person classes, virtual classes? Is this curriculum designed for like self-learning? those are some examples of formats that the curriculum could be in. Again, this is a scope. What does the entire thing look like? Oops. Okay. So another part of the scope is what content will be covered. And this, again, was identified in your in the analyzation process. What themes or domains will be included? Are we going to develop this curriculum from a cultural centric position, meaning that it's designed around our specific culture? Is this going to be designed around seasons, the activities that your people would normally do, your ancestors did? Is this curriculum going to be designed around school functions in order to build language so that people can interact in a school environment? Is this curriculum designed for household communication within the family? You know, they're all going to look different depending on how your content, the content that you're selecting to work with. How many words are going to be in this curriculum? You know, these are important questions to answer in order to help you develop this curriculum. So again, we're looking at the scope, which is the overall look at the entire curriculum. So in developing the scope, then you can now outline and organize the curriculum structure. This is taking the scope and breaking it up into sections so that you can so it's not just one big long curriculum that has no breaks in between. So the sections within the curriculum or the scope can be, you can call them units. The units can be based on themes, or the entire curriculum can be based on themes. You can have specific domains within the scope. So these are all part of the design process in helping to structure your curriculum. That's breaking it up into parts so that there's natural breakpoints in the curriculum that you can then do evaluations of those sections with the students. You know, how well did they learn? Are they progressing? Are the teachers, you know, facilitating the acquisition of language effectively? That's what the breaks in between the curriculum can be organized around. So, and also in determining the scope, then you need to know, you know, how many words am I going to teach? For example, I have determined that 10,000 words is a start for bringing people to an intermediate level of fluency or proficiency. So in my curriculum, I need to gather and organize 10,000 words and grammatical features in order to produce this curriculum. Are these words going to be focused on the basic level and intermediate level and advanced level? You know, what grammar features am I going to put in this curriculum? I need to identify all of these things in order to develop a full curriculum. If you don't have these things, then when you go to implement your curriculum, you'll have the tendency to go in many directions and get off task, and it's not as efficient as having a well thought out sequence. And we'll get into the sequence next here. So the next process, you've identified what your scope is going to be. You know what your needs are, and you have your guiding principles in developing the curriculum. Now comes the actual work of putting it all together. So you want to have a curriculum development team, or maybe an individual. And curriculum development doesn't have to come from a specialist, a curriculum specialist, someone that has studied curriculum development formally. Curriculum can be developed by anybody, really. It just requires the ability to conceptualize an end goal or product as attained or assembled from individual steps. That's basically what you're doing in developing a curriculum. Any language community member with the capacity and ability to understand and see the language parts leading to the determined goal can develop a curriculum. You just need to know where you want to go and how you build those steps to get there. Your curriculum development team can include first language speakers, second language speakers, learners, linguists, teachers, anybody with that capacity to see an end goal and assemble it from individual parts. So the next part in developing the curriculum is creating the sequence of learning or the learning path. What are the steps? Where do you start? And what's the next mile marker, so to say, like in a map? You know, how am I going to get to the end? To the end. That's what the sequence is. So the sequence is creating the actual curriculum document and all the support materials. That's creating the learning path, and it's scaffolding the learning process. And by scaffolding, what that means is you're laying a foundation for the next level. So when you start off in a sequence, a learning sequence, the first information that you receive provides the foundation for the next sequence of information that you're going to learn, and so on. It just builds and builds and builds. It scaffolds the learning. The sequence is also developing the individual lessons and the course content. Lesson plans are essential, especially for language communities that have teachers that don't have a great amount of experience teaching language. The lesson plans can help teachers stay focused. It can provide guidance for them to for different activities. It helps organization of the learning environment, and it's an essential part of the curriculum. Also, part of the development process is creating all of those learner and teacher materials that support the learning of the students. They also support the teacher in facilitating the acquisition of language or the transfer of language. These can include the manipulatives, props, any kind of scripts that may be essential. This can be audio and video recordings of the material within the lesson, or support materials for the lesson. This can include all the self-learning that students can do, the homework that you can take home outside of class. And for some more resources on developing curriculum, the NLCC resource library there at that website address has a lot of information to help with the process. So I encourage you to go and look at that and use any kind of supports to help develop your curriculum. So the next, after you've identified the needs, and you've analyzed your community and determined what it is that you're going to be doing, you've created the scope, and that's the the over the what you're going to teach. You've developed the sequence. That's the individual steps, the lessons that are going to take place in order to get you from the start to the end, and to achieve your goals. Um, so now comes the implementation of the curriculum. And this basically is producing the curriculum, printing it, and distributing it to the people that need it. A critical step in this is to train the teachers that are going to implement this curriculum. And you want to train the teachers on what's the mission of the curriculum, what's the goals, what are the objectives and the outcomes going to be. This is very essential information for any language teacher to know, because again, it helps you stay on track and on target, and helps you to achieve your end results that you want to accomplish, your goals, in an efficient manner. So you need to train the teachers on the mission, the scope, and the sequence of the curriculum. And then finally, we can now teach. And that's implementing the curriculum. And again, depending on the skill levels and ability of your language teachers, the lesson planning part of a curriculum may or may not be developed by the curriculum team. Oftentimes, especially with very skilled teachers, teachers like to create their own lesson plans, and they use their own teaching methodologies to implement the curriculum. So again, that really depends on the capacity of your teachers, to their skill and ability levels to transfer language. And finally, it's time to teach, and we teach and we teach and we teach. And teachers use their skill and their abilities to facilitate that learning process. So after teaching, whether that's after you complete a unit or a lesson, or you wait till the end of the curriculum, which is not advisable, but you should evaluate your curriculum as it's going. And the evaluation process, you can use many different things to evaluate the efficiency of your curriculum. The first one is using language proficiency assessments, and that is to determine, how well or what level of language use can my students achieve. It also can be to monitor word acquisition rate, and that's how many words does my students learn in whatever given time that you have. So say, for instance, 5 words per hour. That is my recommended word acquisition rate is 5 words per hour of teaching. Other ways you can evaluate the language is through teacher and learner journals. And this is what I would recommend that you would implement in any curriculum development process. Is you want teachers and learners to journal after every class session, and you want them to answer the questions, what worked well in this lesson or this unit? What were the challenges of this lesson or unit? What sequence was well aligned in this unit here? Were there things that need to be reordered? And what are those things? All these, you want your teacher and your learners to journal this information, because this can be used to in the evaluation process to refine your curriculum so that the next iteration of it will be more efficient. Maybe you can teach more words or whatever it is that you might identify. So that is the curriculum development process. The refine process is basically starting at the analyzation process again, and again redetermining your needs. Maybe your needs have changed. You've identified something through the evaluation process. Maybe you want to move on to advancing your curriculum or expanding it, whatever it may be. But that is the curriculum development process. Now I'm going to provide two examples here of curriculum examples. So this first example here is what I call a structured immersion course. And this is a 2,000-hour sequence curriculum. So in this curriculum, the mission here is to increase teaching capacity by producing and implementing a 2,000-hour, 10,000-word sequence learning path. And the goal is to have 5 individuals complete the learning in 12 months with an intermediate proficiency level. And my objectives are to design and develop the curriculum in year 1. So this will be a 2-year project here, curriculum development project. So after year 1, the curriculum is implemented with 5 to 10 individuals in year 2. At the end of year 2, I want to evaluate and refine the curriculum. So this is my structured immersion example here. So my guiding principles for this 2,000-hour curriculum is that a structured immersion curriculum is the most efficient method in transferring language to non-speakers. Learners acquire language in an accelerated natural sequence. So I'm kind of defining what my sequence is going to be. Teaching and learning tools and aids are essential for effective language transfer. So again, I'm setting this up for myself that I definitely need to create teaching and learning tools for this curriculum. The curriculum must be continuously refined and incorporate every new understanding of the language. So this is a guiding principle that as new understanding comes available in the language, that then I want to incorporate it within this curriculum. The curriculum sequence must be organized to scaffold learning in an increasingly efficient manner. So again, this is telling myself and my curriculum development team that we want to increasingly make this this curriculum more and more efficient as time goes on. And assessment data must be continuously evaluated to find areas for curriculum improvement and instructional enhancement. So again, I'm setting up these guiding principles of my curriculum development to help me with the development process, to help me with the refining process, to stay on target of where we want to go with this curriculum. So the organization of this curriculum is going to be, again, 10,000 words, which will achieve an intermediate fluency level. The learning rate is going to be 5 words per hour. And this curriculum is going to take place over 2,000 hours of direct instruction. So some possible schedules that I can work with are listed below here, and that's 40 hours per week, which would be about 1 year. Or if that's not available and that's not realistic for my community, I can do 20 hours a week over the course of 2 years. And then if that is not realistic either, I can move it even shorter and say 5 hours a week, which is 1 hour a day and that would take 8 years to achieve the same level. So this is the structured immersion. So my learning sessions are going to be oriented. That means they have specific goals within each lesson. The sessions are going to be 1 or 2 hour sessions, depending on what part of the language I'm teaching. There's going to be 5 to 10 vocabulary or grammar concepts per hour of learning. Again, this is all telling me how I'm going to develop the curriculum. Grammar concepts are going to be implicitly taught. Again, this is all setting up how I'm going to structure my curriculum. There's the learning path is going to be scaffolded, meaning that previous language will be incorporated strategically in future lessons. We'll use circling and recycling as ways to re-inject language into the curriculum. So again, the structured immersion is going to be based on organized language knowledge. That's going to be vocabulary, grammar, also be incorporated as worldview and cultural perspectives. And we are going to use proficiency scale to help organize and categorize our language knowledge so that we know where to place different parts of the language within its curriculum. So a proficiency scale is a measure of language ability, and our proficiency is a measure of language ability, and fluency is the ability to communicate. So if you don't have a proficiency scale, it's important to have one in order to organize your language knowledge. And your language knowledge is what is going to be used to develop your curriculum. So structured immersion in this example absolutely relies on organized language knowledge. And in my example here, I can use a simple proficiency scale as simple as beginner, intermediate, or advanced, or whatever language you want to use to create your proficiency scale. You can use the ACTFL scale, which I would use personally for my curriculum development, which is very well documented. It has good levels here, which is the novice, intermediate, and low. And I'm going to organize all of my language knowledge around this scale so that I know what to teach at each level. So organizing the learning sessions, your individuals are going to be, your first language speakers, the learners, mentors, linguists, language activists. I'm going to have a team of individuals gather and document and organize this language knowledge. The learning path is going to be developed directly from the language knowledge. And it's through language knowledge and creativity that the lessons will be developed. And the language acquisition methods that I am going to use are total physical response, TPR, TPR storytelling, and these will all be through immersion. So I'm going to get through this one here quick. So this is an actual curriculum that I developed for my language, Salish immersion, at my Salish immersion school. And the mission of this curriculum that I developed was to increase the language proficiency of my certified teachers and support staff. So this was to elevate their proficiency levels in the language. So the goal and objective of this curriculum was that the students would acquire language at 5 to 6 hours per word of instruction through an immersive, safe, and respectful environment. The students will receive and acquire vocabulary and syntax in a scaffolding manner. This course This curriculum is 440 hours of direct instruction. There's a 2-hour minimum per lesson. There will be 2,500 words in this curriculum, or there are 2,500 words in the curriculum. Interrogative structures, basic syntactic structures, proform word usage, and imperative structures are all part of this curriculum. So I'm just stating what this curriculum looks like. And so this course that I developed was taught in 2009, 2010, over a 22-week period. And it was held 4 hours per day, 5 days a week. In both classes, the students were made up of 5 immersion school staff members. So some of the materials that I had to create for this were the lesson audio recordings to help the students outside of class. I had to create texts, which were short stories that incorporated the vocabulary of each lesson. I created lesson outlines, and I created instructional aids. Those are things that I use for myself to keep me on track. Some of it was scripting, some of it was just illustrations or diagrams. And as well, I created the student study materials. So the course structure was basically vocabulary building, phonetic practice, which is pronunciation, and it was all immersive content focused, meaning that the entire class was immersion and focused on the content. I used total physical response storytelling as the method to teach. As well, I use syntactic diagrams to help students understand parts of the grammar. So this immersion course was designed around units, and these units were selected based on the school environment and the things that the teachers needed to communicate within the immersion school. So I have 20 units in this immersion course, this curriculum, and you can see there all the different topic areas. This was units 1 through 10. This is units 11 through 20. So again, this all is very, very goal-oriented and specific things that I'm going to teach specifically for the school environment. So the lesson planning is that I want to create compelling, comprehensible input. That means fun, dramatic, engaging, unusual. I want to focus on 10 words per hour of instruction, 5 to 10 words. And each word needs to be heard in context 80 to 200 times so that it is put into long-term memory. So these are all the things that I incorporate into lessons of this curriculum. Again, the lessons need to be compelling, comprehensible input. That's make language understandable, use props, pictures, and dramatization, act out language scenes, use humors, make the learners laugh, use psychomotor skills, make learners move and interact with the lessons. Circling with TPR is was very important in this curriculum. And the example of circling is in TPR, one of the commands would be stand by the chair. And then you would proceed to ask the circling questions, which is of each of the students, did you stand by the chair? Again, these are the questions get more and more difficult to answer as you go down. Where did you stand? And then asking somebody else, who stood by the chair? Did she stand by the chair? Why did she stand by the chair? All these things are circling questions around the command stand by the chair. So as an example here, this was one of the sentences in the curriculum. SpongeBob. So again, I'm using some unusual language, or not unusual language, but just creative language that helps inspire people to remember. And then I go about asking questions about this specific sentence, again, circling questions. So I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to go to the end here. Thank you.